host from 2,000 years ago. Everyone serves the keynotes first, but when the guests have listened freely, they go for the panels. But you have kept the best keynote until now. For that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Natalie Welfens, a scholar who doesn't just study migration governance, but rethinks it from the ground up. As principal investigator of the Tetramak project, she leads a transdisciplinary team exploring how technology is transforming migration and asylum systems. Drawing on political sociology, science and technology studies, and migration research, her work focuses on digitalization, with inclusivity and co-creation at its heart. Dr. Welfens is deeply committed to participatory action research. She ensures that the voices of frontline staff and migrants aren't not only heard, but help to shape fairer, more responsive migration policies for the digital age. Today, Natalie will answer the question, why has migration research so little impact, in her lecture on knowledge practices in policymaking and migration studies. Ladies and gentlemen, here before you is Dr. Natalie Welfens.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, also for the invitation to be speaking today. And in a sense, the last panel really was a great introduction to this talk because we have already touched upon the question of impact and also the challenges and opportunities of research collaborations where both academics and practitioners are involved. And I would like to also connect to yesterday's keynote a little bit, which just as some of the recent political discussions and events also in this country has shown that migration really has really powerfully shown that migration remains one of the most politically charged, socially complex and economically significant issues of our time. And especially since what came to be known Europe's 2015 refugee or migration crisis, we have been continuously talking about migration and mobilities in politics, in media, and in society writ large. We have also heavily invested in research into different aspects of migration, and in that regard, migration research has really flourished in the past decade. And the puzzle that I would like to address with you today with regard to migration research, but I think we can ask the question maybe more generally, is why, despite this exponential growth of migration research, its impact on policymaking and public debates really remains strikingly and sometimes shockingly limited. And tonight I would like to invite you to explore with me why this is the case, but also what we can do about it. And the following draws on an article with almost the same title, Why Has Migration Research So Little Impact? Examining the knowledge practices in policy making and migration research, that I published together with my colleague, Dr. Katharina Natta from Leiden University in International Migration Review last year, and where we also draw on the excellent work of many colleagues who have studied knowledge dynamics in policy making and in research. There are too many to mention all of them, but any of you who is interested, please do take the time to read the article and look up some of the sources. So let me begin with an example to also connect to yesterday's introductory keynote by Heinde Haas. I'm sure many of you are aware that in response to this 2015 migration crisis, the EU launched the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which is a 4.9 billion trust fund, emergency trust fund to address, I quote, the root causes of migration on the African continent. And at the time the trust fund was launched, but also throughout the different phases of implementation, many migration scholars actually reacted with frustration and even disbelief. Why? Because as we have heard in yesterday's keynote, there are really now decades of research that have shown that development aid does not automatically reduce or even stop migration. In fact, development tends to increase migration, at least at the short and medium term, because it's actually poverty that traps often people in place, while investment in education, networks, economic opportunity, and so on actually expand people's capacity and aspirations to move. And among migration scholars, this is a very well-established insight, and it's also known among policymakers. We know that because there has been so much research on this migration-development nexus. And yet the narrative of development against migration persists. It's not only repeated in public discourse, also at the national level, but it is increasingly built into EU development funding itself, despite a lack of supporting evidence. And this disconnect between what we know and what is done is what we call the knowledge policy gap. And the migration development myth, as Heine de Haas calls it, is just one example. The list is long, and maybe if you're not in the field of migration, you can think of other examples where you know the research and evidence points into another direction than what policymakers actually do. In the context of migration, we can think of, we have heard yesterday about the problem of smuggling and trafficking, where then often the fact that it's the lack of legal pathways that actually creates the business model of smuggling in the first place is often neglected. Or restricting access to welfare to deter migrants, even though we know that welfare is rarely the decisive factor in settlement decisions. Tightening visa regimes, we have heard yesterday about that, even though we know that such restrictions actually reduce circular migration, freedom of movement, and tend to lock people in permanent settlement. Or another example that we just discussed yesterday in one of the coffee breaks, the criminalization of search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean by NGOs, although really by now several studies have proven that there is no so-called push-pull factor when NGOs are present in the Mediterranean Sea. You don't get more people to leave, but you just get higher numbers of deaths when NGOs are not present. So all these examples raise this question, why has migration research so little impact, apparently? And I think that this is puzzling for at least three reasons, which I think also connect to some of the things that we have heard and seen in the past 2 days. So the first one is that historically migration research as a field really emerged to inform policymaking in part. This is where parts of it came from. And the second one is, and I think that has also been very, very present in the last discussion, is that policy actors, practitioners, they are interested in research, in evidence. They do want to do evidence-based policies that actually work. And the third one, and that I think at least from my perspective, is somewhat specific to migration research, or which was the puzzle that also drove this research article, is that we have more institutionalization, we have more research. Really, migration research has boomed in the past 10 years, and yet we seem to have less impact when we look at policy making in the world today. And what we argue in the paper is that maybe if we look at the dynamics of knowledge production and use, not only in policy making, but also in academia, and that is something one of the speakers in the last panel also mentioned, we need to look both outside and inside. If we look at the knowledge dynamics both in policy making and in academia, then maybe this knowledge gap is actually not that surprising after all. And that's something that I would like to explore with you today and hopefully also then discuss after the talk. So maybe before I delve into this, let me just start by saying a few words regarding my own academic journey, and this is also something that we do in the paper to kind of explain how we came to it. So my journey in academia began just when migration studies was really rapidly grown as a field and becoming more established. I remember trying to find a thesis supervisor for a thesis that touched upon both migration and gender, which like 10 years ago was really not that easy. And so I first started to work on migration as a master's student, then later on as a research assistant, as a PhD researcher, as a postdoctoral researcher. And I've seen the field taking off. There was a real gold rush in migration research that coincided with this migration crisis in 2015, but then also was bolstered by every new crisis and recently, of course, with the displacement from Ukraine. And like many others, I have also benefited from it immensely, I want to say, through the new journals that were created, research centers, networks focused on migration. I've highlighted, of course, how important migration is to help secure funding, like the research group that I'll start leading, in organizing events, developing research, and so on. I've also had the opportunity to speak at policy-focused events, and yet, just like Katharina, my co-author, like recently, I've had an increasing unease, both when looking at the dynamics in policy making and just not understanding how we can produce all this research and then it doesn't seem to land, but also sometimes when being in our own academic bubbles and thinking about how we produce research. And I'd like to begin by looking with you at the dynamics, at the knowledge practices in policy making, which, as I said, is the first side of the coin that I'd like to look at. And here we can distinguish between knowledge use and knowledge production, which is also a little bit, when you look at the research approach the topic of knowledge differently. So the researchers that look at knowledge use, they tend to understand knowledge as something that is given, a resource that can be either used or disregarded, but they are primarily interested whether knowledge lands in the policy making circles. And then why is it that from the perspective of these researchers that knowledge on migration doesn't land? The first one is, and that's a scholar that has been mentioned yesterday, the work by Christina Boswell, who has shown that actually oftentimes in migration policymaking, knowledge is used symbolically. So she distinguishes between instrumental knowledge, where you really use knowledge as a resource to make better and evidence-based policies, versus the symbolic use, where you use knowledge and it's real factual knowledge, but it's cherry-picked or curated in a way to legitimize already existing position or to increase your institutional power. And that's a dynamic that we see time and again in policymaking. And that's, of course, related to the second dimension, institutional dynamics. And that is that we know that evidence can get easily lost in the bureaucratic maze of policymaking, especially in the field like migration, but I think nowadays really many topics that we have also covered in these past 2 days are cross-cutting. So you have several ministries, EU institutions and agencies, international organizations that are all involved. And also, as was said in yesterday's keynote, they tend to look at it sometimes with a bit of a different angle, a different perspective, or they have also their own interests at stake. And then knowledge in this complex institutional setting becomes a tool of power struggles and organizational self-preservation. One of the examples that we quote in the paper is that the European Parliament actually dismissed its own internal research on search and rescue missions in order to maintain a stronger negotiation position vis-à-vis the Commission and the Council. And what makes it difficult then for researchers, and again, this is something that was mentioned in the previous panel, is that we as researchers sometimes really struggle to identify who is our right policy audience, or what are effective ways to communicate our knowledge, and that to communicate knowledge effectively, we need relationships of trust that have to be ongoing. And therefore, it matters whether research, how research and policy is structured, whether this is through personal networks, advisory bodies, or in-house research units that you have, for example, also with regard to migration, and that oftentimes have a closer connection to policy making in the first place. So ultimately, what counts as valid knowledge often depends also on the evidence itself, but also on trust, timing, and political alignment. And that brings me to the third factor regarding knowledge use, and that is politicization. We have talked about it also here, and in a sense, it is a no-brainer that the way that knowledge is used in migration policy is always strongly shaped by political dynamics. And migration really, as I think we've seen in all past elections of the last 5 to 10 years, is highly visible and often a really polarizing issue. And these political pressures can help, this is what we know from research, can both help and hinder the role of research. It's really context dependent. So in some instances, politicization actually helped to give researchers a stronger voice, whereas in others it weakened the connections between researchers and policymakers. And these political dynamics, of course, can push decision makers to either ignore the evidence that doesn't align with their agendas, or they may also use it again symbolically just to prove that something is being done. So to go back to this EU Trust Fund for Africa, which I have researched together with a team in Amsterdam and at the University of Gothenburg, we have looked also at the monitoring and evaluation system of the Trust Fund. And we were really struck by the fact that there was a very comprehensive monitoring and evaluation system, which is really rare for most migration policies. It rather comes from the development side of things. And we were wondering, so you're setting up a policy which from research we know will have limited to no results, but then you also have this monitoring and evaluation framework. How come? And what we actually found was, yes, they could do a lot of monitoring in terms of showing how many trainings were delivered, how many items were delivered, but the side of evaluation where you really prove the impact of the policy, they couldn't say much, if anything, about it because there was no baseline survey. There was no baseline study to assess what was the status quo and what was then the situation 5 years later after the first phase of the trust fund. And that for us was a case where the EU wanted to clearly show that something is being done, that the EU is also, subscribes to evidence-based policy making, wants to closely monitor what is happening on the ground, especially after some criticism, like for example, the close collaborations with some autocratic governments. And it was something to just bolster its legitimacy as an actor, but in terms of real substance, it was rather thin. And that brings me to the dynamics of knowledge production in policymaking. And some researchers even would approach policymaking itself as a form of producing knowledge about migration. So these are questions like, how is migration framed? How is it framed in policy debates? And how does it shape people's understanding of what migration is? And there the focus is that really how we come to know migration is deeply shaped by powers of nation states and especially global north, especially the states in the global north, just because of the power asymmetries that there are. And migration scholars have shown that producing reports, statistics, but also official categories for people on the move, it's not a neutral act, right? It's political in the sense that it can problematize certain forms of mobility more than others. It shapes how migration is understood and the responses that are seen as legitimate or appropriate. So it actively then shapes also what knowledge can make it to the policy arena. So for example, when governments classify people into categories like refugees, foreigners, natives, and so on, these labels then justify also, for example, unequal treatment or why certain populations need to be controlled and others less so. And of course, this state-centric view then limits whose voices count. So scholars drawing on decolonial or post-colonial perspective, which is one of the recent turns in migration studies, have highlighted how the knowledge of migrants, civil society groups, or actors from the global south is sidelined or has just less impact in the policy arena. And so the second aspect is that how migration is framed in policy making shapes, of course, also the concrete actions that can be taken. So when we continue to frame migration as a crisis and a security threat, this will limit the kinds of responses that are seen as possible and appropriate. Again, something that was mentioned in a panel yesterday. In other words, how a problem is framed defines what solutions are considered. And this matters also for knowledge production in policy circles. So for example, IOM, UNHCR, Frontex, they also have their own research units. They produce maps. So I think Frontex is the most powerful example, the EU agency that's in charge of protecting Europe's external borders. It produces so-called risk reports, where risk then relates to the risk for European borders. And it has these very, impressive, I want to say, maps of Europe, where it shows then, migration trends with big red arrows. And scholars have looked at these ways of knowledge production from the perspective, like, how is migration represented here? Very much as a threat that endangers Europe when you see these disproportionately big errors coming from different sides. So these are really just some dynamics in policy making. But as I have said at the beginning, this is really only one side of the coin. And with that, I'd like to turn to the other side, that is migration research and its own knowledge production. And let me start by saying something that I think is really universal and not specific to migration studies. Maybe it is somewhat specific to the social sciences and humanities, and that is that impact in the metrics that we operate in is not necessarily a priority. It's not easy in the academic structures that we need to navigate. And that is that the day our daily work is structured doesn't prioritize impact, because we are very busy doing other things to jump through all the different hoops, especially as early career researchers. And that applies, I think, more to the university world than to the work in think tanks and some research institutes. Because at the university, our work and our success is usually measured by a very different set of metrics. It's about how many books and articles we published in higher-ranking journals, the number and size of research grants we secure, the prestige of the institutions on our CVs, and the awards we collect. And these benchmarks that define then academic credibility are especially difficult to navigate for early career researchers who operate often on short-term contracts while juggling heavy teaching loads, supervising students, and performing the often invisible labor of what we call academic self-management. And in all of that, knowledge dissemination, then public engagement and impact is something that many of us, I think, aspire to. But it often comes on top of the already long list of duties that we have. And we perform these duties in a neoliberal academic market, which also matters for the way we produce knowledge, and I'll come back to that in a second, that rewards working in existing power structures and reproduces also a number of access barriers, as they have been mentioned also in the last panel. So these collaborations or conferences, as this one here, that brings together academics and practitioners, they are really seldom, partly because, as was mentioned, we first need to find a common language. We need to identify questions that we share. It's usually the extra mile we have to walk. But also because they are not necessarily highly rewarded within our own academic circles, not always. I think there is now an increasing awareness that we need it also in order for our research to be successful, but it's really, really not the norm. Also, when we look at how we disseminate our knowledge, oftentimes in research projects, it comes at the very end. It comes in the last year, the dissemination phase. This, again, is also, I think, something that is changing, I think, with the calls that bring researchers and practitioners together from the very beginning of the project, that build it into the call for proposals even, so that you have this close collaboration from the beginning onwards. And then there is the last aspect also mentioned in the last panel, that is the kind of research we produce. So these are articles of usually 20 to 30 pages, some of them hidden behind paywalls, and they are just not very accessible. I mean, like, who is going to, on the one side, it's demanded that it's peer-reviewed and it's in a good academic article, in a good academic journal, but on the other hand, who's going to read these 30 pages that in some instances are really theory-heavy or full of academic jargon that we need to use, we feel, in order to convince our respective academic audiences. And with that, I would like to come to some of the aspects that I think are more migration specific, but maybe they also apply in other fields. And the first one is that just like in policy making, also in academia, there are dynamics of institutional self-legitimization and issue politicization. So we can think of the different turns that we have seen in migration studies, where we always self-legitimize why we now need to be more reflexive or do decolonial, post-colonial migration studies. In that sense, I think there is a political economy of certain topics in migration studies that is maybe not that different from the dynamics in policy making, where certain issues are really politicized and trendy and people have to jump on it. So if we take, again, the 2015 migration crisis in Europe, it really triggered a wave of new research projects, dedicated conferences, publications, much of which also adopted then the framing and the categories of European policymakers. And as a result, we have seen then a disproportionate focus on certain themes, and the focus on refugees and displaced people, which, as we have heard yesterday, is a small proportion in the overall migration volume. But this is something that we kind of contributed to by focusing so much on these particular groups and these particular problems and hotspots in migration geographies. And as a consequence, then, we focus on migration and asylum in Europe, while other regions or migration experiences really remain under-researched, simply because they are seen also as less politically urgent or also less fundable. And this then also has, of course, just like in policymaking, has consequences who gets to produce knowledge or who benefits from these dynamics. And these are, as we know from research, tend to be researchers that are located in the global north and in Europe, and also particular, so the migration research centers that were created, they concentrate in certain parts of the world and also within Europe, whereas other voices from Global South research, for example, are really marginalized. So when we criticize these power dynamics in policymaking, I think we also must recognize how similar dynamics operate in academic research, structuring whose knowledge counts, what topics gets visibility, and ultimately also who gets to define the field of migration studies. And second, and that really was one of the key puzzles that drove this article, is that we have this growth of migration studies as a field, but it also seemed to went hand in hand with fragmentation. So since I started to work on migration in the 2010s, this field has grown so rapidly, but it has also become more fragmented to an extent that it's difficult to actually sometimes follow what is going on. I've just been 7 months on maternity leave, and you come back to your work and you feel that the debate has yet moved on and there is so much you have missed. And that is also because we have seen the rise of distinct subfields, like forced migration studies, return migration studies, mobility studies, critical border studies, and more. And each of these subfields then tends to create their own networks, conferences, sometimes even their own dedicated journals, and importantly, their own ways of thinking about migration. So in that sense, these strong communities with their own norms and expectations, they work a little bit like what we call academic tribes. Because there are these codes in these communities, and they are very powerful. So there are certain concepts one ought to know, and people one ought to cite, or institutions and questions one ought to study, to then show respect and gain respect to these respective subfields. And while then the internal conversations are often very fruitful, there tends to be less engagements across the different sub-communities. So as migration researcher Favel concludes in a recent review of the field, migration studies has never been so fragmented or uncommunicative across subfields, even as we would argue, precisely because it continues to grow and gain mainstream disciplinary recognition. And obviously, this fragmentation and lacking dialogue is also because of the competitive and neoliberal character of academia, where we constantly are incentivized to actually carve out our research niche. We need to legitimize the research that we do in papers, jobs, and grant applications by showing that existing approaches are insufficient and our approach will be better than others. And these dynamics seem to be particularly acute in migration studies due to the increased politicization of the issue. But I'm sure they can be found in other fields in a similar way. And third, and relatedly, migration scholars then are not only fragmented in terms of their research focus, but also with respect to how they define impact. And that is one of the, maybe also within the field of migration studies, one of the provocative theories that we put forward. And very crudely put, and let me just emphasize that this is really simplifying just for the purpose of making an argument. In migration studies, we can distinguish between the reformist stance and what we call the revolutionary stance. So the reformist, very crudely put, believe that we can, if we just, research is a resource that we just need to communicate more effectively, that needs to be just better presented and then used. So their goal is to optimize knowledge transfer and just to fine-tune interactions between scholars and policy actors, but perfectly believing that this is perfectly possible. The criticism against this group or side of the spectrum, of course, is that this can come across as a bit naive and ignorant of the power dynamics in policymaking, and that there's the big risk of being co-opted by policymakers. On the other side of the spectrum, you have what we call the revolutionary stance, very much in the tradition, or very much coming from the angle that it's power shapes knowledge production. So also, again, a little bit of a different research focus, I would say. And the goal is then, in the most extreme form, to just resist any kind of connections with state actors and to rather build coalitions with other groups, more societal actors or activist groups. But then the criticism towards this kind of approach, of course, is that you risk abandoning the idea of having impact on policymaking altogether, and you might end up just deconstructing problematic policies without proposing any kind of alternatives. And as I said, this is really, it's two sides of a spectrum, and many of us would probably put ourselves somewhere in between, or on some issues we might stand closer to one end of the spectrum than another. But what we argue in this paper is that this division has really also recent in recent years due to this, what we call academic tribalism. So rather than recognizing the value of diverse strategies or also diverse research focus, the critical stance on the one hand and engaged dialogue on the other hand, these different camps, as we can call them, really sometimes discredit each other's legitimacy. And then what is the result of that? We argue that it undermines our collective credibility and the impact that we could collectively have as migration scholars on policymaking and public debate. Because to an extent, it allows policymakers to cherry-pick perspectives or dismiss inconvenient voices, which I think is particularly problematic in an era of post-truth politics. So if we as scholars don't recognize and address these internal divides, we risk marginalizing ourselves and then weakening the impact that we can potentially have. The challenge then is not just how to bridge the gap between research and policy making, but also how to navigate and bridge the gaps within our own fields, within our own collective, within our own research communities. That brings me already to the conclusion and the way forward. And I wanted to, after Hein decided to conclude on a very optimistic note, I thought I'm a bit younger than him. I should do the same. I have to. How can I be more pessimistic than he was? So let me try. So the message really for me, and this is something that I can fully subscribe to the question then is how, but the key message is that I think especially in the times now, we cannot give up on impact and on trying really hard to steer policymaking in a more evidence-based direction. But this, I think, is not only a task for scholars, nor is it only a task of policymakers. It really can only work if we join forces. And there as well, I think, in the last panel when Max asked Anna, how can we do better? What would you actually need from us researchers in order to have evidence that you can then use in your practices? I think this is precisely what we do need to do more in both directions to create this joint understanding, the common language, to walk the extra mile and to somewhere then meet in the middle to understand how we can really join forces. So I think this who needs what, when, and how, this is what we kind of need to work on. And my message to migration researchers, or really just researchers here in the room, is that I think the way forward really involves fostering dialogue across subfields, but also across sectors and disciplines, to really encourage collaborative research that, as I said, builds in this perspective of what is needed on the ground. And then finding ways to also present research in a more unified and more impactful way to policymakers and the broader public. And that, I think, relates to a fact that where, Hein was very optimistic, because he said, well, if you ask people, they have very nuanced positions on migration. But then you could ask, why do we have the election results that we see all over the place today? And therefore, I think we really do need to do a better job in translating our research findings to work towards what I would call migration literacy, but I think you can speak of literacy in really any kind of field, and that is knowing some basic facts to take informed positions in debate and voting decisions. Because, for example, it's true that we have seen, if you look at election studies, there was an increasing trend that, the younger the voters, the more liberal, more progressive they are. In Germany now, this is not the case anymore. We see that now the younger generation is as polarized as the older generation, and that radical right positions are becoming increasingly popular among young voters, especially among young men, which I find really extremely worrisome. And it makes me think that with respect to migration, this is the generation that was really politically socialized after the 2015 migration crisis and really politically socialized into this crisis narrative. And then I think that after talking for more than 10 years so intensively about migration, we need to have a better basic knowledge about some of the basic facts, some of the things that people like Hein and other researchers present in their research and in their books. We don't need to read them all, but I think we do need to know some basic facts, such as the distinction between migrants and refugees, who qualifies as a refugee, how the temporary protection directive works for Ukrainians, or why it is that people can only move irregularly oftentimes, or that there is this lack of legal pathways. So I think these are some of the basic things that we need to work on, because yes, migration is a complex topic, and no, we don't need to know all intricacies of it, but a basic level of migration literacy is, I think, something we need. And then I'd like to conclude with what my suggestion or my way forward with respect to policy making would be. And there, again, looking at research is important, because research on populism has shown that if mainstream political parties just reproduce populist rhetorics, they will not necessarily benefit from it, because people then tend to vote the original. And I think that's important, because especially in today's climate, it seems more urgent than ever for policymakers to engage meaningfully with evidence and academic knowledge. And that is because democratic institutions face this mounting pressure, and alternative facts are used to legitimize exclusionary policies. And therefore, I think grounding decisions in evidence is not just good governance and a way to have more effective and efficient policies, but really it's a defense of democracy itself. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Right, we have a microphone, so number 1 and number 2. I can see 2 people so far.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. A lot of interesting points, but I will just ask 2 questions. Maybe our ambitions about impact are simply too high. Maybe we should have some kind of a benchmark and measure what could be achievable by the advice of researchers. And another question connected to that, but maybe actually we achieve quite a lot advising the policymakers. Let's make kind of a thought experiment and imagine how the matters would look like in Europe without migration scholars and what we are actually telling to the policymakers.
Yeah, thank you. I will start with the second one because I think you're totally right. I mean, as you can tell, we wrote this article with a bit of with a lot of frustration in mind and looking at the things that we know on knowledge production, knowledge use, and policy making and academic research. But I think what we would actually need is research on impact. So, I mean, we do know a little bit, but we have no really systemic overview because oftentimes, and I think maybe this is also what your question points to, the impact that we have might be very subtle, or as was mentioned in the other panel, right, it might take years. And then we know it. I mean, in the UK, you have the REF, right? You need to prove that you have impact. It's also now the Netherlands have introduced similar metrics in their grant applications, where impact on policymaking is a criterion. So I think something is shifting there, but it's often like when I had to fill in the form for a grant proposal, then didn't get funded. It's very difficult to say, oh, okay, I advised a policy maker back then in a round with also, 10 NGOs, but was it because of my impact and what I said? But I think getting a better sense of also how to measure, like first understanding, we took a deliberately broad notion of impact to really be as inclusive as possible, and in order to also show that people that define it very differently. And we'll have so for those of us going to IMISCO, there will be a follow-up discussion with other researchers because we wanted to have this as the beginning of a conversation. What do we understand as impact, right? And this brings me to your second question. Are our ambitions of impact maybe too high? I think that's a question that we should really ask ourselves as a discipline, or maybe figure out what we want to focus on. I think what is just frustrating to me is to see all the money and time that goes into it, and some of the things are debated, right? There are issues where you have, depending on how you study it from a qualitative or quantitative perspective, where you can have ongoing debates. But some of the things are fairly established. And that even these things that we as migration researchers would say, like, these are facts, they are disregarded in policymaking, which seems to be so driven and kind of preoccupied with this crisis narrative. And there, I think, I personally cannot accept that there we don't have the impact that I think we should have as migration researchers. And there I think we should insist on the fact that there are some facts that you need to take into account, because otherwise, ultimately, your policies will fail, right? I think this is the ultimate risk that you also suggest that we, I don't know, I can speak mostly on the German debate because this is what I have been following quite closely. And then we are, when you have these bold messages of we will do massive returns, or we will now we will refuse that people can enter the territory. It's not only unlawful, and then all the, migration community mobilizes and problematizes it from a legal perspective, and yet it is done kind of as a really, I think, symbolic act, and we'll see what happens to it. But I think these are things where ultimately also policymaking risks to lose its credibility when they then do policies that do not work. So there, I think I would insist on us trying to have as much impact as possible and also prioritizing it in the current times. But as I also said, I think in the current setting, in the academic setting that we are living in, and where we do need to do it on top, in a sense, it is quite ambitious, I would agree.
My question is quite in line with what you just said. And it was two words that you had on your slide. So the idea of literacy and factfulness. And it seems like these concepts are very far out of favor. And the conversation doesn't really require or value these ideas anymore. Do you think that it's your role, the collective you, to try and convince people of these ideas? And if you've tried, like, what has worked? Because I don't think other people are trying this. Politicians certainly aren't. And
yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I think you are right in your diagnosis that factfulness seems to not be en vogue these days. I think there's a real risk that, and I can see that happening among researchers, that we retreat, that we give up, because it seems that that it's just not the time and place where we can convince people by facts. But I think if we give up on that, then we give up on everything, in a sense, right? So if you ask what works, and that's again a question that I think we need to discuss collectively, I mean, as researchers, but really as society as a whole. And it's something that we among migration researchers also discuss time and again, because we know what doesn't work. What doesn't work is the 10th open letter to the newly elected government, or just like sometimes you're lucky and a newspaper picks it up. But these are things that do not seem to work because they don't reach enough people, I would say. I think that we also need to think about other channels and as I said, like translating it, boiling it down, maybe doing all a training on how social media platforms like TikTok work and to translate our research findings. I don't know, maybe this is a way forward. A more offline and very basic way forward that I truly believe in is teaching. It sounds so boring, but I think really education is, in a sense, the most powerful tool, especially if we want to address young people. And I can see it with my students who, at the beginning of the semester, they don't know much about migration, and I really like this semester. I was shocked also by how much they have internalized some of the discourse. They all speak very easily about the migration waves, about the migration crisis, about people who come here who come for illegitimate motives. They have really internalized some of the discourse, but through like just the semester, so this is now six weeks onwards, I can already see how it's changing, how they are thinking, how they are speaking, becoming more nuanced in their claims, looking for additional evidence, and being genuinely surprised. I think just like many of us yesterday, right, in the first keynote, when, for example, Heinde has mentioned that a lot of migration is actually internal within China or within the African continent, right? So just myth busting on the everyday level, on the day-to-day business, in teaching conversations with friends. I think it's very heavy in a way, because you need to constantly do it. It's really the Sisyphus task that you need to do. But I think that ultimately this is what hopefully will change something.
Thank you.
So
And
now it's
question?
now it's my turn. May I have just 2 or 3 comments and then 2 questions? Or
Yes, please. We
So
still
let-
have a lot of time for
Yeah, so
more questions.
I will use this
This
opportunity.
is a very different session from the previous ones.
So let me start with comments, and there will be basic ones. So first of all, thank you for pinpointing several things. The first one, I know it's obvious, but it's great to know that we should not blame one side only, in fact. This is the first point. The second point is about mentioning how impact, in fact, is being valued in academia. And I can only hope, for example, that these people who are responsible for example, funding schemes, they know it. I can only hope that this is the case, because exactly as you said, for example, in this country, we have something which is called third mission of the university, and this is about societal impact. And of course, many people just start thinking about it every 4 years when you have evaluation of scientific disciplines, yeah? Because apart from this, and this is what you said, really, it doesn't matter. What matters is just academic production and not that much impact. And then we have, for example, Horizon Europe projects. And in my opinion, there's a kind of tension. Maybe you can discuss it also further. This is what most of us do, but this is not natural, as you said. This is at least my impression. And the third comment, what is absolutely key is that this is what you said, is just interaction and real exchange. And in my opinion, this is why also we have events and conferences like this one, because in my opinion, we are only in the beginning. So we need to learn how to do it in a proper way. So that's why also the previous session was so important, when we just have a real examples how to make it efficiently. Because it's very, this is difficult, particularly for those people who are just doing mostly academic kind of research. And two questions. The first one is, because you mentioned the very rapid development of migration studies as subdiscipline, and the question is, to what extent this rapidness matters for the question you're asking. And the second point is maybe more serious, and I would refer to the morning session about democratic backsliding, because the question is, in fact, do we really need evidence these days? Maybe what we need is just how to manage emotions. Of course, this would demand as well sort kind of evidence, and apparently in many countries, politicians, they do quite well in terms of managing emotions, but the question is, do we still need evidence?
Thank you.
Can we ask
Can I-
a supplementary?
Just answer the other two questions
Can you
first?
hear me?
Time for the answers.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you also for the remarks, and that indeed, I mean, I just wanted to re-emphasize that I think it's never one-sided. And this question of, how impact is valued, I mean, this is something that some powerful institutions and universities themselves could change, right? Because it's also the question of hiring committees, right? Like, what do you hire people on? Like, you hire them based on their CVs, and you count their publications and the impact factors of the journals, which I think is really very limited. And to your two questions, the first question on subdisciplines, yeah, I mean, I don't. Again, one would have to like actually look at the evidence. The evidence that we draw on is a study by Peter Scholten and Asya Pisarevskaya, and I think others, who have traced this this fragmentation dynamics, and have shown that that these subfields then tend to really speak only among them. So this is something that you can actually show when you can do fancy network analysis. And this, I think, is really problematic to an extent when we among migration researchers don't have a common language anymore. And in that sense, well, I wonder, I don't know, the rapidness and the growth of the field, I mean, they also link it to the concrete dynamics, like more funding, more professorships on migrations, more journals, more conferences, and so on. So I do think that this contributes to it, but I mean, I do not focus that much on causal explanations in my own research, so I would have to defer that to other people. And the second question, do we need evidence? I mean, I think it links back to the other question on like factfulness and evidence, which is not very popular. And one might indeed, I mean, there's research that looks at only that, right? That studies emotions and politics, and it's an open question. Again, I would say that we cannot and should not give up on facts. And I think that, I mean, there is the research of Andrew Geddes, right, who together with the EU has worked on the question which framings of migration actually work, right? This very much goes into this direction. But this can only be, I think, part of the story. I think it's the combination of the framing, we shouldn't use a framing just because it's effective if it's not grounded in facts, for example, right? So I think, again, maybe these are two sides of the same coin, where we do see that narratives, framing, and so on, stories about migration really matter, but they have to be underpinned, they have to be grounded in facts and factfulness, I would say.
Thank you very much. Sir?
Okay, I think it's a supplementary question, and that is, it's hard to disagree with you at the very general level. It's true of migrations, it's true of defense, it's true of health. Most areas of public policy have this problem. I think I slightly disagree with you, however, when it looks at the production of evidence, the academics. I think we are tribal. That's the nature of the beast. We probably will be much poorer if we are not. I think we have to disagree. It has to be contestable. But the problem is, as I can see, is that there is very little transmission of knowledge through information to people who can possibly do something about it, because there is very little incentive for people who can do something about it actually to act. There is adverse selection. And I don't quite know how you propose to address that. I mean, how for someone of my generation, a baby boomer, you could have Mr. Trump elected in US? For me, it's an abstraction. And yet it's a reality. How come? So do you have a formula for improvement? I don't.
Well, from sciences, we went up to practice.
The answer will be very brief. I also don't have a formula and I don't have a magical recipe, I'm afraid. We can try to develop it tonight over 3 bottles of wine. Maybe we can, of course, this is something I cannot explain, and many of the things that are happening, they seem to be irrational, that at least half of, or the majority, but oftentimes it's a very close call, right? But then more than 50% votes despite the facts, one would think. The question is, like, did they know? Do they believe it? The facts that are out there, and then do they matter? I don't know. I cannot explain the election of Trump, I'm afraid. The tribalism, I think you might be right that this is, it might be just intrinsic to academic knowledge production to a certain extent. I wonder, but for that I would need the insights from other fields, whether it's that confrontational or really siloed as I experience it in migration studies, because there you would have people at the extreme sides of the spectrum that I outlined, who would just consider the other side of the spectrum as illegitimate. They would consider them as activists, or they would consider them as totally co-opted researchers who are rubbing shoulders with the policymakers in an opportunistic way. And I think that because, migration is so much about, migration in a sense is about how democracies treat the outsiders, right? It is a topic where human rights, fundamental rights are so center stage, and where, there were very intense discussions also about what position should migration researchers take, and that sometimes when you do take a position in the current debate and the way that the also discussion has shifted, even with positions that are just grounded in evidence, you are already seen as an activist. So I think these things might be something that are, I would say, somewhat particular to a field that is so concerned with human rights and human rights violations, I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I believe the last question, please.
Thank you. It will be a comment and a question. So first of all, I wanted to thank you because actually this will to have impact brought me to the research. So it's quite important to know at the very beginning also like how it looks later on. And I think I have a remark that we are here during the conference organized because of Polish presidency in the EU. And as far as I see, none of the representatives of the government state during this presentation, nor during yesterday's keynote speech. So I feel that maybe also referring to what was said at the beginning, we did what we could do, and it's a bit too much to expect more than is possible. And the question would be also referring to Trump's win in US and what's going on politically now is my explanation for that is that things that are easily digestible win, and this content just speaks to people. And I'm thinking like how what you mentioned also, like how to present the results of the research so that they will be understandable for public, for the society. I was just thinking like how to do it, how to frame it in a simple way that can counter the content that you can, for example, easily find on YouTube. And I think that's what people base their knowledge on. And that's what we are struggling with. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for the remark and also for the question. I will try to resist to also do a second attempt in explaining Trump's election. I mean, the examples are really, they are manifold, right? I mean, not starting, but one can think of the Brexit or Trump's first election or many other things. And I think, yeah, like some of the things we know, right, about populist rhetoric, about easier messages, but also about scapegoating, right, and this us versus them rhetoric that we have. I mean, we've seen it time and again in history, and that's another thing that I find frustrating when talking about my students. How how narratives around migration have shifted, but they often end up in this us versus them. So I do think you are right when saying like one of the things is making it more digestible, making it simpler. And we as migration research, we tend to emphasize that it's complex, and sometimes I think we also shy away from taking positions or just saying things in a blunt way, because we do it sometimes for research proposals because we know that people have less time and we need to be very brief and also very bold. But we don't do it in academic articles, and this is where they are 25 pages long, because we need to, be all nuanced and nod to the different crowds and so on. So I think this is part of the story. And then the other thing that just came up when you also said like thinking about the platforms and so on. I think the question is like, who is exposed to which kind of knowledge, right? And also who controls the platforms. And then, the tech billionaires are probably the most powerful example, but also, I mean, the AfD in Germany has been quite good, we need to say, when it comes to using TikTok. And maybe these are indeed things that we need to think about, just like where we produce our knowledge, where we as researchers gather, whether we shouldn't leave the university buildings, and whether it's enough to just put our recordings online, put our policy briefs online, or write a blog post on the latest article that we wrote to then tick the box that, hey, I've put it online, it's open access, everyone can read it. I think this is really, unfortunately, not enough.
Thank you. And I must repeat the words, unfortunately, there is not enough time for more questions. Let us, however, thank Dr. Natalie Welfens for all her time, for the great lecture on knowledge practices in policymaking and migration studies, and of course, answers to all your questions. This is the end of the conference for today, but please stay on for one moment more, because there is one more very important thing to do today, I believe. And perhaps you may also want to learn what is in store tomorrow. Tomorrow is Friday, the 6th of June. At 9 a.m. Central European Summer Time, we meet here for an hour's session on currently open 2025 calls for proposals of all destinations of Cluster 2, that is culture, creativity and inclusive society. Then we go on without a break at 10 for a 90-minute session entitled Navigating Opportunities and Challenges, Early Career Researchers in Transnational Projects. And then we have a break for lunch and networking at 11:30, so it's a very early lunch. At 1 p.m., we move to the Faculty of History for your opportunity to present ideas for Cluster 2, of course 2025, called Destination 3 Topics, followed by a Horizon Europe side event, Cluster 2 on-site brokerage meetings, and it's also held at Faculty of History. And the conference will end around 3:30 p.m. So that's the plan for tomorrow. I hope all those of you who are interested will be here infallibly. But there is one thing more to do, as I said. We've thanked the volunteers as some of them finished the duty. I believe it's time now to thank all those who help us override the curse of Babel Tower. We have Zuzanna Błachuszewska and Arkadiusz Falkiewicz, who help our Polish-speaking audience online. Could I please ask them to come down the stairs? They'll be here in a moment. They still have stairs to navigate. And the two ladies you can see in the corner, I'll ask them also to come to the center of the floor. It will probably take some time because there's some equipment, so that we can have, together with the English interpreters, also the interpreters of the Polish Sign Language, and they are Mariola Kozłowska-Nowak and Marlena Florczyk, working for our remote participants. There they are. There they are. Absolutely deserved. And now I suggest a big round of applause for you, because you have stayed here to the end of the day. So a big round of applause to you. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.